And last thing I'll say is that if you're giving an answer and I interrupt you, it's not personal. It's me trying to have,
It's fine. Yeah.
an editor mindset.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right, Jay, thank you so much for joining us on Longevity Blog today. We're really, really interested in your novel piece of technology that allows continuous measurement of blood pressure. And you're the Chief Medical Officer at Aktiia, and you're here to tell us about that technology. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me here, Nick. It's my pleasure.
So, one of the things we want to ask you up front is blood pressure monitoring. We know it's really important. You really have to look hard for somebody who hasn't had their blood pressure taken. It's part of the status quo in medicine. But usually we're only getting a single point of measurement, maybe two or three if our doctor's particularly curious. We're using a blood pressure cuff on the arm. Sometimes it's still a stethoscope involved, pretty old school. But there's now the ability to measure blood pressure continuously. And we were really curious to know up front, give us something juicy. What's the most interesting thing that measuring blood pressure continuously reveals versus it being measured just once or twice a day?
Well, it's to me, it comes down to the main reason that, or the main way that blood pressure actually causes death and disease to your body, and that is it does it over long periods of time. And so taking one measurement at one moment, at one point in time, maybe once or twice a year, really does not allow anyone, a physician or a patient, to understand what is their blood pressure trends, fluctuations, consistency over long periods of time, over weeks, months, years. In fact, there's no current or traditional technology that allows us to do that until very recently, and that's really what our company is trying to do. And that is our central perspective about blood pressure, is that consistently optimizing blood pressure over long periods of time is really the goal about how to mitigate the risk of blood pressure-driven diseases. And to do that, you need a tool that allows you to consistently assess, look at, manage, and optimize your blood pressure over long periods of time.
And the reason behind this, there's this word called hypertension. And hypertension is referring to systolic and diastolic blood pressure measurements above a certain range that we've established through clinical research, that is the healthy, borderline, and unhealthy ranges. And to be above the healthy ranges, you're creating the risk that you're talking about. Now, for many people, they're unaware they have hypertension. There's this concept called masked hypertension. What does that term mean, and what is the approximate percentages of adults who have masked hypertension?
So masked hypertension is a term that refers to situations where people have normal appearing blood pressure in the physician's office when it's checked by a nurse or a physician, but at home, which is where we spend 99.9% of our lives, in the at-home environment, they have higher than normal blood pressure. And so in effect, it's essentially missed, and people can go years, decades with having higher than normal blood pressure. And that is what is called masked hypertension. And that's about 15% of the population who have hypertension. Another version of that is called white coat hypertension, which is sort of the inverse, where someone has high blood pressure in clinic, and so the physician gets worried, the patient gets worried, but actually normal blood pressures at home. And so then physicians are unaware or uncertain about what is this person's true blood pressure trend and pattern. And all of these things get at a central point, which is what you started with, which is oftentimes, well, very commonly, almost always, people don't have any symptoms from high blood pressure. And it starts fairly early on in life, in 20s, 30s, and 40s of life, precisely at the point in time, the decades where we are the least aware of our own health, the least proactive generally, we're not interacting with healthcare systems on a routine basis, but that's when blood pressure tends to start. And only after years and decades, for many reasons, not just masked hypertension, white coat, but just for many reasons, often goes undiagnosed. And that's over that period of time is really when blood pressure really starts to do its significant damage. And so again, getting at the idea of consistently assessing your blood pressure over long periods of time, even if there isn't some apparent problem, or even if you don't have any apparent symptoms, is really crucial to actually understanding, what is your blood pressure, pattern.
Right. And this discussion of a blood pressure pattern, masked hypertension, blood pressure maybe being higher or lower when you're at your doctor's office versus when you're at home. Blood pressure values are also changing throughout the day. They're changing based on your activity level. They may be even changing based on your diet, hydration levels. So there's a lot of variables that are involved around blood pressure. And this is known. This isn't a surprise. We know this about blood pressure. And for quite some time, there's been options for taking what we call ambulatory or 24-hour blood pressure monitoring device with you that gives you maybe a full day, maybe a few days of blood pressure data. But that, even though that's been available for quite some time, there's not very much uptake to that, even though it would elucidate and highlight the things you're talking about. So why don't we see more people using continuous blood pressure monitoring data?
Well, there's probably several reasons. First of all, it's dramatically cumbersome. It's a real pain to use it. There are reimbursement issues in many countries where it's often not paid for, or not paid very well for a physician or healthcare system to actually do it, which of course, limits the motivation in some ways. And even if they did, or even if someone did use a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitor, which, just if anyone's not quite aware of what it is, it's a regular cuff that stays attached to your upper arm for the entire 24 hours. You cannot remove it, and a fairly large box that goes with you that you have to kind of put on your belt or carry around with you for that 24-hour period. And about every 15 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, it'll go off. It'll inflate, squeeze your arm, and take a blood pressure measurement, even when you're sleeping. Or trying to sleep, as it were, and not being able to, because this thing keeps going off. So it's really kind of cumbersome. And for all those issues, reasons, it's not used very commonly outside of usually highly specialized centers, hypertension centers, or academic institutions, or some other select sort of healthcare centers. But even if someone does it, remember, it's 24 hours. And generally, it's not repeated on a yearly basis, or every 6 months, or every 3 months. It's generally done once, and usually to answer a specific question. For example, if someone's confused about a physician is confused about what is this person's true blood pressure, they suspect white coat hypertension, masked hypertension, or some other confusion about what this person's blood pressure is, then that's the scenario where we might order a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitor, and it is done almost exclusively through physicians. You need a prescription for it. And so even if you did it, it's for a single 24-hour period. And as you just said, blood pressure fluctuates continuously. Day by day, it changes. Week by week, it might change. Month by month, it might change. So even if you have a bunch of readings all on one day, 6 months from then, 12 months from then, the next year, if diet changes, if your weight changes, if your alcohol intake changes, if you change medicines, if you change all the other factors that affect your blood pressure, that pattern changes. And so there's even been studies that while it's considered the gold standard of assessment of blood pressure, there's even been studies to say that if you're done on the same person, repeat the test 3 months apart as standard 24-hour ABPM, about 3 months apart, there can be up to a 40% variability in the readings you get. So again, it is a kind of a snapshot, usually 1 day's worth of data, and it's helpful. It's a good, it's as good as it gets in traditional medicine as in regards to blood pressure. But that's what a standard 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure measurement does and is. And that's the kind of data you get from it.
Okay. So up at the top there, we talked about what I heard to be three real barriers in my mind. And one is you've got to go to your doctor to get it. And you might get some insurance back. There's the cost barrier to whether or not that device costs you out of pocket. And this device is particularly cumbersome and not very comfortable. And if you're wearing it at nighttime and it's going off and compressing your arm, I can imagine that disrupting my sleep. I'm sure that that's common for others. And so this brings us nicely to discussing the solution that Aktiia has developed in their very unique combination of a cuff, a bracelet, and an app that allows us to see blood pressure continuously. And so you've actually said to me in doing the research for this interview that we're not actually an ambulatory blood pressure monitor company. That's not what we are at all. We're going into a completely new space where we have continuous measurement. So framing that, and based on what you just said, having this technology you developed for continuous blood pressure monitoring, let's turn that around against all the cons you just mentioned. What does that enable for everyday at-home use? And what can it help us learn?
Yeah. So first of all, it's easy to use. It's simple. It's a easy to use wearable. You could just put it on your wrist and you kind of set it and forget it. Once every month, you have to do a calibration step that takes about 10 minutes driven through the app and using the cuff. But that's about it. Otherwise, you just have to keep it charged and wear it. And, Swiss design, kind of elegant design. And what it enables is for you to just not have to think about the act of taking blood pressures. So, typically with any device, traditional cuffs, you have to kind of think it's an active process. You have to sit down, you have to create a space for yourself, you have to sit in the right position, have the right environment, do all the things that you're supposed to do to take an accurate cuff measurement. With our device, it's all built into the programming that it takes accurate measurements at the right time, and it's all programmed in there. So all you have to do is essentially keep it charged and wear it. And so on average, you get about 27 readings per day. And so it's not taking every minute because there's too much motion of the wrist to take accurate readings and other limitations. But it's on average taking once or slightly more than once an hour. And again, remember, going back to our primary perspective is that consistency of blood pressure over long periods of time is really what we're trying to solve for. So we actually think it's less important, and as most physicians do, what is your blood pressure at one point in time at one day? That's less important. What's more important is to compile hundreds, thousands of readings over long periods of time and to really depict and allow you to understand those trends. And there's so many things that sort of measurement unlocks. And the closest analogy that we have, and as most people know now, are continuous glucose monitors, going from single finger stick glucose to tell you what your blood sugar is, to going to a device that you wear and it basically tells you, hundreds of readings over days, weeks, and months. What are your blood glucose trends? Well, the same idea goes. There are some slight variations in the idea, in the themes, but that's really the idea. And so for the first time with this data set of, let's say, 800 data points in a month of blood pressure, you can start to see trends and sometimes do this sort of personal sort of trial, personal sort of clinical trial, where you do an intervention targeted at your blood pressure and see its effect. And you can see that cause and effect much more clearly with this broader, bigger data set that this technology enables. And that, again, is one of the cardinal issues with blood pressure management, is that as a physician, and I do this, I have done this for years routinely, if someone comes in with high blood pressure, I'm going to give them the same 7 lifestyle changes, all of which are extremely difficult to do, and some medications. And I really don't know, and neither does that person, which one of those 7 changes and which one of the medications is actually going to work best for them. We have no idea. We recommend the same thing to pretty much everybody.
We're going to talk about that, because I really like that point, because that's really valuable to understand what's working for you And there's this
Yes.
opportunity here with this rich data set to do some self-experimenting. And Jay, before you go on and into that, I want to just ask one or two questions about
Sure.
this technology, because
Yeah.
it seems that you mentioned it's elegant, it's Swiss design. There's a really cool story here and how this piece of technology was developed. And
Yeah.
we're going to talk about how to use it. But before we do that, let's talk about where it came from,
Sure.
because
Sure.
we're immensely curious. This is a big advancement to make this the equivalent of a CGM for blood pressure. That's a major development. And as I went through the history of the company and looked up some of the founders and the background to it, your website even points to this, that there's 18 years of research and development behind the technology.
Right.
And that some of that core work actually came out of novel research done by your CTO
Yep.
in his PhD research. So can you tell us just briefly some of the key milestones that have allowed this
Sure.
technology to come to exist?
Yeah. So yes, I mean, it all stems from our two co-founders, Doctors Josep Sola and Mattia Berci, and they met in Switzerland, in Neuchâtel, at a sort of an engineering think tank called CSEM, which I didn't know about till I joined the company, but it's the Center for Semiconductors and Electronics and Microtechnology. It's in Switzerland. And basically, it's this giant engineering institute where it's all about discovery of novel sensors and technology. And so all the way back in 2003, 2004, these two doctors were starting to do their PhDs and their thesis and really study this technology of optical signals, which are the signals that you see on all commonly worn wearables with the green LED lights and the optical sensor. Well, this is 2003, 2004. The iPhone wasn't developed yet. There was no such thing as a smartwatch. And they were starting to use these sensors to try to derive physiologic parameters. So the first thing they did was to go and study if they could measure heart rate. Again, before the Fitbit, before watches and all these things. And so they developed a way to look at optical signals and derive heart rate from it. And now many, if not most, of these technologies around the world eventually licensed some of their scientific work and discoveries. So after they did that for a few years, and heart rate was dramatically easier than blood pressure, so they tell me, then they said, well, what else? Now we've learned a lot about how to look at these sensors and look at these optical signals. What else can we start to learn about? What else can we start to derive? So then they said, well, could we try to derive blood pressure from this data? And so that started an 18-year journey. And they started with, this wasn't just an engineer, sort of just electricians and biomedical engineers. They started with animal wet lab, with pigs, studying their arterial physiology and how the sensors and the optical signals reacted to them. So they did it in animal models, then they did it in human models, and then they eventually got a working prototype together in about 2017, to the point where they thought they could go out, spin it out, and commercialize the technology. And so in 2018, they actually spun out from CSEM, created the company, and started work on Aktiia. And so now the company itself is about 5 years old now.
And so the core technology, so the core technology behind this measurement we put on this wearable, it's not using a compression cuff actively, it's not inflating, it's not making any noise. This is an optical sensor.
Yeah.
How does that technology work? You mentioned understanding arterial dynamics. I imagine there's some fluid dynamics in there. There's trying to guess pressure changes based on estimated dilation and contraction and diameter of blood vessels or arteries, veins, etc. Just give us a bit of insight into that.
Yeah. So the way it works is it takes these lights that are the two green LED lights on the back of all of what you see. Most smart watches and devices have that. And the same type of thing sits in this pod here. There's nothing actually proprietary about this hardware. It has two LED lights, an optical sensor, and a three-way accelerometer. And what it does is it shines those lights into your skin, into the capillary bed, the tiny vessels of your that are just underneath your skin. And it gets a reflection back. And that reflection back into the optical sensor creates a sort of a waveform. similar to an arterial waveform, not quite, but it's the same idea. And they take about 30 to 50 waveforms, compile them together, and then through the device, it sends it from your device to your phone via Bluetooth, and from your phone to the cloud via the Wi-Fi connection or a cellular connection. And in the cloud, that's where the algorithm that they've developed over almost 20 years now goes to work on those optical sensors. And they were able, after all this time in discovery, to build an algorithm that picks out the salient features of those waveforms for them to be able to derive accurate blood pressure and heart rate, and then delivers that data back to your app as blood pressure, heart rate data.
Right.
So that's how it works. So you can't feel it, as you said correctly. You can't feel when it's taking a measurement. There's no cuff. There's no squeezing, and so yeah.
Thank you, Jay. And so there's an important step in this where there is a cuff. And I wanted to just make sure that it was clear what that cuff represents, because when you go to your website, you see it there, and you might think, "Oh, I have to wear that," but no, you're doing a once a month initialization. Right. Where does that fit into enabling the algorithm that you just described?
So the simplest way to describe it is it puts the numbers in terms of millimeters of mercury. That's the only thing that's missing from the algorithm, is that it derives a number and it can use these waveforms to track changes, but it needs something to tell it the units of millimeters of mercury of this is what this waveform and this measurement is, a number has to have a unit as millimeters of mercury. That's what the cuff is for. And so once a month, by regulatory, mostly for regulatory approval, that's what that step is for, is the cuff. So it's not used routinely. It's just for that once a month calibration step.
Right. And then you were starting to mention just now some comments around regulation. This device has actually gone through some of those required steps. There's 5 clinical trials, that some of which you're the co-author on, I believe, that have worked on the validation for this device. So can you just give us a few bullet points around how we know this device is both accurate and precise with these continuous measurements?
So all blood pressure devices in countries are regulated medical devices. And so in all the markets that we're in, we have to have regulatory approval. And regulatory approval generally means that you have to prove that your device, whatever it is accurate as compared to a reference device, some standard other device that is well accepted and has proof for. So we have regulatory approval across the EU, UK, Canada, and Australia, New Zealand. And when we do our validation studies, we don't compare ourselves to a standard automatic upper arm cuff, because the range of error of standard upper arm cuffs is actually fairly wide. So it's not a great comparison to go for. And so what we have designed and developed is a fairly complex and very sophisticated, and I would say highly rigorous validation step, or validation protocol, that we run in Lausanne, Switzerland at the University Hospital, in their hypertension specialty lab, whereby our standard reference that we compare ourselves to this technology is what's called double auscultation. So what that means is, people are generally familiar with, an auscultation method where you see a doctor or a nurse using a stethoscope to listen to the artery and the carotid cuff sounds to measure the blood pressure using a cuff. And so we do that, but with 2 observers at the exact same time with a bifurcated stethoscope. So 2 observers are listening at the exact same time to a patient using an electronic mercury column to determine the blood pressure value. And that they have to agree within 5 millimeters of mercury or less on every reference value. And then that is determined as the gold standard reference value, and that's what we are comparing to. So that's how we've done all our validation studies across all the body positions where we have validation data, and that's how we've gotten the CE mark across EU and the UK, Health Canada, TGA in Australia. And obviously the US folks will be wondering about the FDA,
That's my next
which we are
question for you.
actively.
So Jay, when people are going to want to know, what about the
Yeah.
FDA in the United States? This
Yeah.
is a really exciting piece of technology. There's
Yeah.
probably only so much you can tell us, and it might be a bit
Yeah.
speculative, but talk to us about
Yeah.
entry to that market. What does that look like for you in terms of a timeline?
Yeah. It's, it's difficult. It is probably the most conservative regulatory body probably in the world. And so it's a matter of going through their process and meeting their their milestones and the desires that they want to see before they'll think about regulatory approval. So there is clearly a pathway forward with them. It is, all I can say really is that there are several other sort of parts of the puzzle that have to fall into place for us to have a good, successful chance at approval there. And I think that'll happen within the next 12 to 16 months.
All right. Thanks for pinning it down to a range for us. We won't hold you to it, but people are
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah,
curious. So
please
thanks.
don't.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jay. We know how that goes. And so as you've talked about the technology there and how it works, we're getting these measurements across the day. People naturally have questions around what types of measurements they're going to get. And I have two questions for you about certain times of day. The first one is exercise. You mentioned the
Yeah.
accelerometer, the device. I'm assuming that you're not going to get measurements during exercise. But talk to us
Yeah.
around how the algorithm might work with somebody who is exercising, because that's
Yeah.
one thing our audience loves to do, and me personally.
Correct. Yeah, no, totally understand. And so first thing to understand is just what happens to your blood pressure when you're exercising. And physiologically, when someone exercises, your blood pressure generally goes up. Normally, it goes up above the standard reference ranges of a resting blood pressure. And that's normal in most cases. Sometimes it goes up excessively, but most of the time it goes up normally. And then immediately after exercise, generally it actually dips below your normal resting blood pressure and then comes back to your normal. So these are the sudden, what we call acute changes of physiologic exercise. During exercise of most types, if not all, maybe not all, but most types, the Aktiia system will not take a measurement. And the reason for that is two. One is that the accelerometer, when it detects significant motion of the wrist, is the first and primary filter of quality for motion. And it just tells the device, nope, you're not going to take a measurement. And the rationale for that is behind that is that the optical signals in the capillary bed at your wrist are highly sensitive and highly degraded with significant motion. So we don't want to analyze bad data. That's the last thing. We'd rather show no data on purpose than showing bad data. And so that's one of the primary filters. So if someone's exercising, you're not going to get measurements during that time, but you will get measurements before and after. And all it requires is about 30 seconds of stillness of the wrist. And then the device will be able to take a measurement. And it does so about once an hour. And then additionally, if there's a gap in time, let's say a couple hours goes by and it hasn't taken a successful measurement, it's programmed to increase the frequency of trying. So after a few hours, it actually starts trying every 5 minutes until it gets an accurate reading. So it's a dynamic thing. It's not like a standard, ambulatory monitor where it's every 15, 30 minutes, irrespective of what's happening. It's more designed and thoughtful than that, and it tries to do it more often when it knows it's been some gap in time of reading.
Right, Jay, that's really some smarts there in the algorithm, which again goes back to the incredible science and engineering that created this device over those 18 years of research and development. And as we talk about exercise, I mentioned there was two things I wanted to ask about. The second one is nighttime blood pressure measurements. And as I didn't actually understand that there was a good bit of science around this, but this one's particularly relevant to our audience in longevity. There's a lot of research that shows that nighttime blood pressure is more correlated to cardiovascular disease risk than daytime measurements. Now, very few people will have ever received a nighttime blood pressure measurement. Your device clearly is going to enable that. So what is that going to then reveal? Talk to us a bit about nighttime blood pressure measurements.
So you're right. I mean, there's lots of signals that can be gotten from nighttime blood pressure data that you just don't get or can't get during daytime. And unless somebody has worn an ambulatory blood pressure monitor, there's no other way to get nighttime data. And so you can start to see, if you're, diligent about wearing it, you're going to start to see your nighttime data. And what's more important, you're not going to just see it at one night. You're going to see it repetitively, week after week, month after month. You can see what your pattern is. And there are clearly certain signals that are more associated with cardiovascular risk. But even with the ambulatory blood pressure monitoring data, which is all drives the evidence around this nighttime data, there's not, super clear knowledge about what to do with all those markers or data points, other than just to know about it. There's a few things to think about. Maybe you can alter medication regimens. Sometimes it involves sleep disorders like sleep apnea, and things like that. But oftentimes there isn't that much that you can do about it. And so one of the things I think that Aktiia or these kind of technologies of longitudinal monitoring will enable is that the data set is so dramatically different that part of what we're doing, and we're doing this with, many universities and research centers around the world, is trying to understand all possible novel markers that we can get out of this data set. So for example, maybe there are other things we can look at in our nighttime data and correlate that with something that somebody can intervene on, or try a different intervention. Like you said, try your own, make your own sort of scientific intervention and see what happens with that pattern. But it's historically never really been able to sort of looked at in this way. And now all of a sudden we have this data set where we can. But I think there's a lot more discovery to be done, and there's probably many more unknowns than there are knowns at this point.
That makes a lot of sense, because whenever we start to get continuous data or higher frequency measurements in many fields of science, we start to see some of those second order, third order patterns and effects that jump off the page that we didn't see before. So we can really appreciate that. And in your answer there, you started to touch back on one of your points earlier that I promised we'd come back to. And this was your reference that when somebody comes and visits you in the clinic and they have high blood pressure, you give them 7 things to go try. So of course, when we hear that, we're really curious, one, what those 7 things are, and then to talk a little bit about what users of the Aktiia system could do with that continuous data to know which of those things are working. So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, and we can add these in later if you can't remember all 7 off the top of your head, but can you tell us what those 7 things are?
Well, you probably can, and almost all your listeners could too, because they're so well known that, but I'll just list them here, and I may not, hopefully I'll hit all 7, but we'll say, well, you need to exercise more, you need to lose weight, you'll need to decrease alcohol, you need to stop smoking, you need to decrease your sodium in your diet, you need to have a better sleep habits, and decrease stress. Okay. And that has nothing to do with medications. These are just lifestyle sort of habits. And we run through them. Most physicians run through them in like 15, 20 minutes max. I mean, max. Or you just get a handout from the American Heart Association or some other scientific body that says, here's 7 things you can do to lower your blood pressure. Well, here's the catch. First of all, every one of those 7 things to a patient, to a person, is fairly life-changing. These are not easy things to do. Okay, even increasing exercise to over 3 hours a week, that takes an inordinate amount of effort for most people to really adjust their lifestyle. Or if you actually want to reduce your sodium in your diet to the recommended value of 1,800 to 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day, it's incredibly difficult because sodium's in almost all foods. And so let's just take that as an example. So let's say you say to someone, here's 7 things to do, and the person walks out. Most of the time, people are just not even going to listen to all 7 of them, because they're like, that's so many different things that take so much energy. I don't really know how I can do all of those things. And even if they focused on one in particular, let's just take sodium because it's a good example. You say, we'll say to everyone, and everyone has heard this, you should lower your sodium in your diet if you're trying to lower your blood pressure. Okay. Great. So try to lower your sodium. You're going to start reading package labels. You're going to try to eliminate all sauces and packaged foods, processed, all these things that you're going to try. Here's the catch that we don't say, and I don't even think many physicians know. Only about 50% of people are salt sensitive, meaning for fully half of the people that we tell to lower their sodium, it doesn't matter. And there's no way to know who's salt sensitive and who isn't. We don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows. The patient doesn't know either. And there's no way currently to figure it out even realistically. And so this is what an example of one of the things that people can try is that instead of saying 7 things to try, all of which are life-changing, what I would just generally say to a patient who's, let's say, going to wear Aktiia is just try one for 6 weeks and see what happens. Just try increasing your exercise. And that's the only thing you change. That's your one variable you change. And then see what happens to your blood pressure averages and trends over the next 6 weeks. And then if that works, great, then continue that. And then let's look at alcohol. Let's try dry January and see what happens to your blood pressure. And for many people, it won't change. It's not going to make a difference. So you'll eliminate something that might be difficult to do. And you say, well, okay, I don't need to focus on that. My energy needs to be here, here, and here. And you can actually start to get fairly precise about what individually matters. So that's one example. The other example is medications. In medications across the world, all expert hypertension bodies recommend basically 2 pathways of medications. So either you're 55 or above, or 55 or below, or you're black or non-black. And based on those 2 things, you get one regimen of blood pressure medications. And it's the same standard medication regimen. You will get the same as I will, as somebody else will, as everyone gets the same. And we don't really know who's going to respond more significantly to one medicine or another. All the evidence that has ever been done on blood pressure medications has been done in a large-scale population-based way. So we don't know how individual people respond to them, really. And so this is another example about how people can start to use individual data from clinically validated wearables to say, okay, that medicine really didn't work, but this second one really did work. Well, maybe I can just get away with 1 instead of 2. And really start to dial in on their medication regimen in a more precise way, more individualized way.
Jay, we love this because you've just gone through and described self-experimentation. You've done that from a doctor's perspective, from a technology entrepreneur's perspective. That's really refreshing and fun. And you gave us a nice little protocol for trying one of those 7 things. Just change one, do it for around 6 weeks, see if you can observe a change. If it works for you, keep doing it. If not, let's pick another one and try it. Now, with the medication, we're wondering, what does the protocol for that look like? What is the time to act over for that? What would the protocol look like for trying a new medication? How long would you try it for to know that is one of the things that's working for you?
Yeah, that's a little trickier because it's not quite binary. It's not like do it or don't do it because there's doses involved. So usually what I would do and what most blood pressure specialists would say is that you try a medication at the maximum tolerated dose for at least a month, at least 4 weeks to see its full effect. Now you might see it much sooner than that. You often do. But you at least want to give it 3 to 4 weeks before changing it or trying something else. But there's subtlety to it because sometimes if the blood pressure is very high, you don't want to wait 4 weeks to make a change. You might need to go faster. So there's caveats to this. But in general, at least 2 weeks, if not up to 4 weeks before you try adjusting again. And the other main point about in medications is, and I can't even, many thousands of times I've started and changed blood pressure medications. And what we always want is data coming back. As a physician, we want data. So we don't want to change doses blindly, although that's what we do almost routinely because we don't get blood pressure data. People don't check their blood pressure very often. But that 2 to 4 weeks of trial means that that person should be measuring their blood pressure routinely and consistently for that period of time so that when you go back to the physician, say, okay, look, here's my data. And so then we can see, here's where we started on day 0, here's where it is on day 30. And then you can actually make, real insightful decisions about blood pressure medications and is it working? Is it not working?
Jay, thank you so much for that answer. And we understand that it's caveated and that anything like that needs to be done with one's primary care physician, general practitioner, as they refer to them here in Australia. So, Jay, that's really building a longevity strategy for each individual. And that's one of the things we aim to support. And that's getting people to know what works for them. Clearly, the Aktiia system is going to be a great one for blood pressure, for people to know if blood pressure is something they need to be monitoring, need to be intervening in with lifestyle changes first, medication to follow. And in building a longevity strategy, each of us has to pay attention to what works for us and what our risks are. And in closing out, we'd like to hear from you personally, 1 or 2 things that you do to look after your own longevity, if you don't mind sharing.
Sure. I mean, I think the 2 things that I try to focus on as much as I can, and I'm not saying I'm very successful or always successful, but exercise is a primary one. I always try to get as much exercise as possible throughout the week. Some weeks this week has been bad, but I try get at least 3-4 hours of exercise in. And then I think one of the, and I don't know the science behind it, but I think one of the most important things to living a long and fulfilling life is social interaction, laughter, community. And I think that over the last few years, I've really tried to be proactive and purposeful about finding a place in a community and neighborhood and people and family around me that really, give me that support, purpose, and just, unwavering sort of backstop and levity. And so that I think those are the 2 things that I really try to focus on more than anything else.
Jay, thank you for sharing. Those are both excellent examples. We really appreciate you joining us on Longevity Blog here for the interview today. We hope to hear more about when this device will be available in the US. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me, Nick. It's been a pleasure to be here.